Hey guys, tonight the Prussian pawn. The winter of 1744 did not arrive with a whisper, it arrived with a roar that shook the drafty windows of Zerbst Castle. Inside those cold, gray stone walls, a young girl named Sophie Friederike Augusta sat by a dying fire, unaware that her name was about to be erased from history, only to be replaced by something eternal. Sophie was, by all objective measures, a minor princess of a minor house. Her father, Christian August, was a stoic Prussian general who smelled of gunpowder and old leather. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was a woman of frantic ambition, a woman who viewed her daughter not as a child, but as a strategic asset to be traded in the high-stakes game of European thrones. "Sophie," her mother's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Stop daydreaming over those French novels. The courier has arrived from St. Petersburg." The air in the room shifted. St. Petersburg. The word felt heavy, exotic, and dangerous. It was the capital of the Russian Empire, a land of vast tundras, golden cathedrals, and a court so wealthy it made the Prussian royalty look like beggars. The summons of the Empress. The letter bore the imperial seal of Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. It was an invitation, or rather a polite command. Sophie and her mother were to travel to Russia immediately. The purpose was clear, though unspoken. Sophie was to be inspected. She was a candidate to marry the Grand Duke Peter, the heir to the Russian throne. "You are a pawn, Sophie," her father told her that night, his voice thick with a rare moment of pity. "But even a pawn, if it reaches the end of the board, can become a queen." Sophie didn't sleep that night. She looked at her reflection in a cracked silver mirror. She wasn't a classic beauty. Her jaw was too firm, her eyes too sharp with intelligence, but she possessed a terrifyingly focused will. She knew that staying in Zerbst meant a life of quiet boredom. Going to Russia meant a life of gilded peril. She chose the peril. The journey into the great white void. For weeks their carriage rattled over frozen ruts. As they crossed the border, the landscape changed. The forests became denser. The sky grew vast and pale. Sophie spent the long hours in the carriage, not resting, but studying. She had brought a Russian grammar book hidden beneath her furs. "Why bother?" Johanna snapped, huddled in her sable blankets. "You will speak French at court. Everyone who matters speaks French." "The Empress speaks Russian," Sophie replied quietly, her eyes fixed on the Cyrillic characters. "And the people speak Russian. If I am to rule them, I must hear them." It was the first sign of the steel that would later define her reign. While her mother plotted how to use the trip to spy for King Frederick of Prussia, Sophie was doing something much more dangerous. She was preparing to become a Russian. Arrival at the Winter Palace. When the travelers finally reached Moscow, where the court was then residing, the sheer scale of it nearly took Sophie's breath away. Thousands of candles flickered in the windows of the palace, reflecting off the snow like fallen stars. The air in the room was thick with the scent of incense, roasted meats, and expensive perfume. Sophie felt the eyes of 1,000 courtiers on her. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair styled with minimal jewelry. She looked like a child among peacocks. Then the doors swung open. Empress Elizabeth entered. She was a magnificent, towering figure of woman, draped in heavy silks and jewels that clinked with every step. She was the daughter of Peter the Great, and she carried the absolute power of the Romanovs in her stride. Sophie didn't wait to be prompted. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and sank into a deep, graceful curtsy, so low that her forehead nearly touched the cold marble floor. "Your Imperial Majesty," Sophie whispered in broken, heavily accented Russian, "I am your humble servant." A hush fell over the room. The Empress paused. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face. She reached down and lifted Sophie's chin with a gloved hand. "She has spirit," Elizabeth remarked to her advisors, "and she has the sense to learn our tongue. Perhaps this Prussian girl is more than she seems." A bitter disappointment. The triumph of the meeting was short-lived. Soon after, Sophie was introduced to her intended husband, Peter. He was pale, sickly youth with a receding chin and a nervous tic. He did not look at Sophie with romance or even curiosity. He looked at her with annoyance. Within an hour of their meeting, he began to brag to her about his collection of toy soldiers and his obsession with the Prussian military. "I don't like Russia," Peter complained, pacing the room. "The priests are filthy, and the wine is sour. As soon as I am Tsar, I shall make them all dress like Prussians." Sophie realized then, with a sinking heart, that her future husband was a man-child trapped in a world he hated. He was the heir to an empire, yet he spent his afternoons hanging rats in his bedroom for military crimes. She saw the trap closing around her. If she allied herself too closely to Peter, she would go down with him when the court eventually turned against him. If she didn't marry him, she would be sent back to Zerbst in disgrace. The midnight transformation. That night, Sophie made a vow. She lay in her oversized bed, listening to the Russian wind outside. "I will be more Russian than the Russians," she whispered to the darkness. She began a grueling regime. During the day, she was the perfect submissive fiancée, but at night, she stayed up until 3 a.m., barefoot, pacing her room as she memorized Russian vocabulary and Orthodox prayers. She became so obsessed that she fell dangerously ill with pneumonia. As she lay shivering with fever, the Empress's physicians suggested a Lutheran priest be called. "No," Sophie gasped, clutching the hand of a lady-in-waiting. "Bring me an Orthodox priest. I wish to die or live as a daughter of the Russian Church." This news spread through the palace like wildfire. The Russian people, the soldiers, and the clergy heard of the young Prussian princess who loved their faith so much she would call for it on her deathbed. She survived, and when she rose from that bed, Sophie Friederike Augusta was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to be baptized into the faith as Ekaterina, Catherine. The pawn begins to move. The wedding was a whirlwind of gold and incense. Catherine stood at the altar, draped in silver cloth that weighed more than she did. Beside her, Peter fidgeted, looking at the ceiling, eager to get back to his wooden soldiers. As the crown was held over her head, Catherine looked past the priests and the gold. She looked at the faces of the soldiers in the back of the cathedral. She saw their skepticism, their hardness. She was no longer the Prussian pawn. She was a Grand Duchess of Russia. She had successfully completed her journey from the periphery of Europe to its very heart. But as the bells of the Kremlin began to toll, Catherine knew the real war had only begun. She wasn't just there to be a wife. She was there to survive. And to survive in Russia, she would eventually have to take everything.
A cold welcome in St. Petersburg. The honeymoon was a ghost story. There were no flowers. There was only the smell of damp stone and the echoing silence of the winter palace. Catherine, now officially a Grand Duchess of Russia, quickly realized that her wedding ring was not a symbol of union. It was a pair of golden handcuffs. St. Petersburg in the mid-1700s was a city built on bone and swamp. It was beautiful, yes, but it was a beauty that felt predatory. The court of Empress Elizabeth was a labyrinth of mirrors, where a single misplaced word could result in exile to the frozen wastes of Siberia. The Empress's shadow. Empress Elizabeth was no longer the welcoming aunt. The moment the wedding vows were finished, the Empress's warmth evaporated. Catherine was no longer a guest, she was property. The Empress's surveillance was absolute. Catherine's Prussian servants, the women who had known her since she was a child in Zerbst, were systematically dismissed. One by one, they were replaced by state ladies, women whose primary job was not to serve Catherine, but to spy on her. "Do not look so sullen, Catherine," the Empress remarked one evening, her eyes sharp as a hawk's under the heavy lids of age. "In Russia, we do not value privacy. We value loyalty, and so far you are a mystery I have yet to solve." Catherine learned to keep her face a mask of porcelain. She realized that in this court her emotions were her greatest enemies. She began to practice her public face in the mirror, a slight, humble smile, downcast eyes, a posture of perpetual obedience. But behind those eyes, the machinery of a genius was beginning to grind. The treachery of the bedchamber. The most humiliating trial, however, was her husband. Grand Duke Peter was not merely eccentric, he was a man who seemed to actively loathe his wife's intellect. On their first night as a married couple, Catherine waited in the grand bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Peter finally entered, he did not look at her with desire. Instead, he pulled a crate of toy soldiers from under the bed. "Move," he barked, gesturing for her to shift to the edge of the mattress. For the next 4 hours, the future Tsar of Russia staged a mock battle across the silk sheets. He made the sounds of cannons with his mouth. He cursed in German. He ignored the shivering girl beside him entirely. This became the pattern of their lives. Peter would spend his days drilling his Holstein guards, foreign soldiers he brought in because he didn't trust the Russians, and his nights playing with dolls or forcing Catherine to listen to his half-baked military theories. "He is a child playing with a loaded gun," Catherine wrote in her secret diary, her ink scratching aggressively against the parchment, "and I am the one standing in the line of fire." Navigating the social minefield. The Russian court was divided into factions, each more dangerous than the last. There were the old Russians who hated Catherine because she was a foreigner. There were the pro-Prussians who wanted to use her as a puppet for King Frederick. And then there was the secret chancellery, the Empress's terrifying secret police. Catherine's mother, Johanna, made things worse. Johanna was caught sending coded letters back to Prussia, acting as a spy. The scandal nearly cost Catherine her position. "Your mother is a fool," the Empress told Catherine, dragging her into a private audience. "You gamble with your head. If I find one more letter, you and both will be on a carriage back to the border by sunrise." Catherine did the only thing she could. She publicly distanced herself from her own mother. It was a cold, calculated move. When Johanna was eventually sent away in disgrace, Catherine did not cry. She stood on the balcony and watched the carriage leave, knowing that she was now truly alone in a den of wolves. She wasn't just navigating a court, she was navigating a survival horror. The isolation became Catherine's greatest teacher. Since her husband wouldn't speak to her and the court ladies only spoke in gossip, she turned to books. She began to order crates of literature from France. While Peter was downstairs drinking beer and playing cards with his guards, Catherine was upstairs reading Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Tacitus. She was educating herself in the art of power while the rest of the palace slept. She realized that the Empress was aging. Elizabeth was brilliant but impulsive. Her health was failing from years of late-night balls and heavy drinking. Peter was incompetent and widely hated by the Russian nobility. "There is a vacuum forming," Catherine mused as she stared out at the Neva River, "and a vacuum always demands to be filled." The tension reached a breaking point during a court ball at the Peterhof Palace. Peter, drunk on schnapps, began to loudly insult the Russian Orthodox Church in front of the high priests. He called their icons painted wood and laughed at their long beards. The room went silent. The air grew thick with the threat of violence. The guards shifted their pikes. Catherine saw her moment. She stepped forward, ignoring her husband, and approached the head archbishop. She bowed deeply, kissed his hand with genuine reverence, and began to discuss the nuances of a recent sermon in perfect, melodious Russian. The contrast was staggering. The nobles saw a drunken foreign boy king who mocked their god, and beside him a graceful, intelligent woman who honored their traditions. In that single moment, the seeds of the revolution were sown. The court didn't just see a Grand Duchess, they saw a potential empress. The burden of the heir. However, Catherine's position was still precarious for one reason. She had not produced an heir. The empress's patience was wearing thin. A womb that remains empty is a useless womb, Catherine, the empress warned. If you cannot provide a Romanov heir, I will find a way to replace you. This was the ultimate threat. In the history of the czars, replacing a wife often meant a one-way trip to a convent or a quiet poison in the tea. Catherine knew she had to act. Her husband refused to touch her, and the survival of her neck depended on a pregnancy. She began to look around the court, not for a friend, but for a solution. It was here that she met Sergei Satyakov, a handsome, charming chamberlain with a reputation for discretion. The cold welcome was over. Catherine was no longer the frightened girl from Zerbst. She was becoming a player who was willing to break every rule of morality and tradition to keep her head on her shoulders. She was learning the most important lesson of St. Petersburg. In Russia, the only sin is losing.
The atmosphere of the court. To understand Catherine's struggle, one must understand the environment. The Winter Palace was a place of sensory overload. The smell of 30,000 candles burning at once, the sound of silk dresses sweeping across parquetry floors, the constant low hum of whispers behind fans. It was a place where a smile was often a death warrant. Catherine learned to read the weather of the Empress's mood. If Elizabeth wore blue, she was nostalgic and kind. If she wore red, someone was going to the dungeon. Catherine spent her days walking through this minefield. She was a teenage bride in a foreign land, married to a man who preferred puppets to women, and ruled by an aunt who saw her as a breeding animal. Yet, as she looked at the vastness of the Russian Empire on the maps in the library, she didn't feel small. She felt hungry. "Let them think I'm a victim," she wrote in her notes. "Let them think I am a pawn. Winter is long in Russia, but it always ends. And when the ice melts, the strongest roots are the ones that survive." The loveless bed. The door to the imperial bedchamber did not open. It groaned. In the vast cavernous halls of the Oranienbaum Palace, that sound was the nightly herald of Catherine's despair. To the outside world, Catherine was the Grand Duchess, a woman of jewels, status, and proximity to the sun. But once the heavy oak doors were bolted shut, the sun was extinguished. The room was cold, lit only by the flickering tallow candles that cast long, distorted shadows against the tapestries. This was not a sanctuary of love. It was a theater of the absurd, and Catherine was the only audience member who wasn't allowed to leave. The Toy Soldier King. Grand Duke Peter did not enter the room as a husband. He entered as a drill sergeant. Often he was accompanied by the smell of stale tobacco and cheap Holstein beer. "To your post, Catherine," he would bark, his voice cracking with a frantic, nervous energy. The psychological toll began here, in the mundane cruelty of his obsessions. Peter's mind was a fortress of military triviality. He did not want a wife, he wanted a subordinate. On many nights, he would force Catherine to stand at attention, sometimes for hours, while he dressed his dogs in miniature Prussian uniforms. "Look at them, Catherine," he would say, his eyes wide and glassy. "They have more discipline than any Russian soldier. They understand the line. They understand the order." If she moved, he would scream. If she sighed, he would accuse her of treason. The psychological erosion was subtle but constant, a slow dripping of water on the stone of her resolve. She was being married to a man who lived in a world of ghosts and wooden dolls, and he was determined to drag her into his madness. The Incident of the Rat. The true depth of Peter's volatility was revealed in an incident that Catherine would later recount with a mixture of horror and pity. One evening, Catherine entered their shared quarters to find a large rat hanging from a miniature gallows he had constructed on the dressing table. Peter sat before it, his face twisted in a mask of legalistic fury. "It has been found guilty," Peter whispered, not looking at her. "The beast climbed the ramparts of my cardboard fortress. It ate 2 of my lead grenadiers. Under the military code of Friedrich the Great, the penalty is death by hanging." Catherine stood frozen. She looked at the dead rodent, then at the heir to the most powerful throne in Eurasia. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The man who would one day command the largest army on earth was conducting war crimes tribunal for a rat. "Peter," she started, her voice trembling, "is this necessary?" He turned on her, his eyes blazing with a terrifying vacancy. "Discipline is the only thing that keeps the world from collapsing, you German peasant. If I do not punish the rat, how can I punish the serf?" It was in that moment that Catherine stopped fearing Peter and started fearing for Russia. The man beside her was a hollow shell, filled only with the echoes of Prussian drills and a deep, festering hatred for the country he was destined to rule. The silence of the sheets. The loveless bed was not merely a romantic failure, it was a political death sentence. In the 18th century, a royal marriage was a contract for a womb. Every morning that Catherine emerged from the bedroom without the glow of a new life, her value in the eyes of Empress Elizabeth plummeted. The bed itself was a vast silk-covered desert. Often Peter would sleep with his boots on, his saber lying between them on the mattress, a physical blade of iron separating their bodies. He refused to touch her, not out of virtue, but out of deep-seated physical revulsion towards women. He preferred the company of his Holsteiners, rough, unwashed soldiers who enabled his drinking and joined in his mockery of the Russian court. "Am I so repulsive?" Catherine once asked her mirror, tracing the lines of her collarbone. She was young, her skin was clear, and her mind was sharp, but in Peter's eyes, she was simply another Russian obstacle, another thing he had to tolerate until he could turn the empire into a province of Prussia. The psychological toll of being rejected by a man she despised was a strange, bitter poison. It made her feel invisible. It made her feel like a ghost in her own palace. The armor of the mind. To survive the isolation, Catherine began to build a second life, a life of the spirit. Since the bed was cold, she turned the library into her hearth. She began to read the works of the Stoics. She read Marcus Aurelius and learned that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. She decided that if her physical life was a prison, her mental life would be a kingdom. She began to treat Peter not as a husband, but as a patient. She learned to navigate his moods like a sailor navigating a storm. When he was volatile, she was silent. When he was manic, she was a statue. She gave him the illusion of control, while she quietly gathered the keys to his kingdom. However, the loneliness was a heavy shroud. There were nights when the wind would howl off the Gulf of Finland, rattling the window panes, and Catherine would find herself weeping into her pillow, not for the loss of Peter's love, but for the loss of her own youth. She was a teenager being consumed by a cold, gray machine.
The breaking point and the shadow of the convent. The psychological warfare took a darker turn when Peter began to openly flaunt his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. Unlike Catherine, Vorontsova was loud, coarse, and shared Peter's love for crude jokes and heavy drinking. Peter would often force Catherine to sit at the dinner table while he whispered endearments to Vorontsova, laughing as they mocked Catherine's intellectual books. "She thinks she is a philosopher," Peter would sneer, pointing a greasy finger at Catherine, "but she is just a cold German fish. Perhaps a convent would suit her better, a place of silence and stone."
The convent was the ultimate threat. For a Russian empress or Grand Duchess, the convent was a living grave, a place where women were sent to be forgotten, their hair shorn, their names erased from the ledger of the living. Catherine felt the walls closing in. She realized that the loveless bed was no longer just an emotional tragedy, it was a ticking clock. If she did not find a way to secure her position, to provide an heir, or to find a protector, she would be discarded like a broken toy. The birth of the Empress. It was during these darkest nights of the 1750s that the hidden Catherine was forged. The girl who had arrived from Zerbst with a heart full of hope was dead. In her place was a woman of ice and iron. She realized that love was a luxury she could not afford. Passion would have to be found elsewhere. Power would have to be her only husband. She began to look at the guards standing outside her door. She noticed the way their eyes followed her, not with the mockery of Peter, but with a growing, silent respect. She saw the way the servants whispered when she passed. She was the mother they wanted, while Peter was the foreigner they feared. "The bed is empty," Catherine whispered to herself one night as Peter snored in his boots beside her. "But the throne is waiting." The psychological toll had reached its limit. She had been bent until she almost snapped, but instead of breaking, she had become a spring, coiled, tense, and ready to strike with a force that would shake the world. The Enlightenment in secret. The candles in the Winter Palace were a currency of their own. While the rest of the Russian court spent them on late-night gambling, drunken masquerades, and the frantic pursuit of gossip, Grand Duchess Catherine spent hers on something far more dangerous: knowledge. In the mid-18th century, a woman's mind was expected to be a decorative garden, pretty to look at, but shallow in soil. But Catherine was cultivating a wilderness. While her husband, Peter, snored in a stupor of Holstein ale, and the Empress Elizabeth slept in a room guarded by 12 loyal sentries, Catherine became a ghost in her own library. This was the era of her secret enlightenment, the period where the Prussian pawn transformed into a philosopher queen. The Forbidden Library. It began with a single book, smuggled into her chambers like contraband, The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu. To the Russian Orthodox Church, and even to the aging empress, the ideas flowing out of France were a plague. They spoke of reason, of social contracts, and of the separation of powers. These were concepts that could dismantle an autocracy. But to Catherine, huddled under a heavy sable blanket by the dying embers of the hearth, these pages were a map to a new world. "My eyes burned," she would later write in her memoirs. "The ink was faint, and the Russian winter air froze the very water in my glass, yet I felt a fire I had never known." She didn't just read, she devoured. She worked her way through the heavy volumes of the Encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert. She studied the histories of Rome, tracing the failures of republics and the successes of Caesars. She was looking for a formula, a way to rule a land as vast and brutal as Russia without losing her soul to its darkness. The Voltaire connection. Then came Voltaire. If Montesquieu was her map, Voltaire was her North Star. His wit, his relentless mocking of superstition, and his belief in the enlightened despot resonated with her. She began to imagine a Russia that wasn't defined by the whip and the chain, but by science, art, and law. But this was a dangerous game. To be a liberal in the court of St. Petersburg was to be a traitor. She had to hide her books behind the novels of sentimental romance that were expected of a young woman. If a lady-in-waiting entered, Catherine would slip her volume of philosophy under a cushion and pretend to be weeping over a fictional love story. "They think I am dreaming of a lover," she whispered to the shadows. "Let them. A lover can only take my heart. These books will take their world." The architecture of a new mind. The psychological toll of her loveless bed, as we explored in the previous chapter, was now being replaced by a cold, intellectual clarity. She realized that Peter would never be an enlightened ruler. He hated the Russian people, and in return, the people would eventually tear him apart. Catherine began to apply the philosophy of the Enlightenment to the reality of the Russian steppe. She asked herself, how do you give liberty to a serf who has never known the word? How do you bring the rule of law to a land where the Tsar's whim is the only law? She started keeping secret notebooks. In these pages, she drafted laws, planned hospitals, and designed a school system for girls, all while she was still a prisoner of her marriage. She was building an empire on paper, years before she would hold the scepter in her hand. The Midnight Thinker. The physical toll of this secret life was immense. Catherine often slept only 3 or 4 hours a night. The lack of sleep made her pale, her eyes rimmed with red, which the court misinterpreted as the grief of a neglected wife. The Empress Elizabeth once sent her physician to check on Catherine. "The Grand Duchess is wasting away," the doctor reported. "She has the look of one who is haunted." He wasn't wrong. Catherine was haunted. She was haunted by the ghost of Peter the Great, the man who had dragged Russia into the modern age by the hair. She felt his spirit in the cold stones of the city, and she knew that she was the only one capable of finishing his work. But where Peter the Great had used a hammer, Catherine would use a pen. She would not just force Russia to change, she would seduce it into civilization. The strategy of silence. The Enlightenment also taught her the power of the secret self. She learned that a ruler must have a public face and a private mind. In public, she became the most devout of Orthodox Christians. She attended every liturgy, fasted until she fainted, and kissed the icons with a fervor that moved the priests to tears. She was building a pious brand that would protect her when the time for revolution came. But at night, she returned to her forbidden friends. She would write letters in her mind to the great thinkers of Paris. One day, she thought, "I will not just read these men, I will invite them to my table. I will be their patron. I will be the star of the North." This secret education gave her something her husband Peter would never have: moral authority. When Peter spoke, he sounded like a petulant child. When Catherine spoke, even in those early years, she sounded like history itself. The dawn of the philosopher queen. One night, as the sun began to peek over the Neva River, a pale lilac dawn that only St. Petersburg can produce, Catherine closed her book and looked at her reflection in the window pane. The girl from Zerbst was gone. The neglected wife was gone. "I am Russia," she whispered, the words fogging the glass. She realized that the hidden reign had already begun. She didn't need a crown to be a sovereign. She had already conquered the realms of thought. She knew the laws of power, the chemistry of the human heart, and the mechanics of the state. She was ready. The Enlightenment was no longer a secret she kept in the dark. It was the weapon she would carry into the light. As the palace began to awake, as the servants started the fires, and the guards changed shifts, Catherine hid her books one last time. She smoothed her hair, composed her face into a mask of humble obedience, and walked out to meet her husband. The pawn had reached the end of the board, and the transformation to a queen was nearly complete.
The first spark of rebellion. The year was 1758, and the air in the Peterhof Palace felt thin, as if the very oxygen was being consumed by the flickering shadows of conspiracy. Catherine was no longer the wide-eyed girl from Zerbst. She was a woman of 29, tempered by 14 years of neglect, surveillance, and the icy silence of a failed marriage. For years, she had survived by being invisible. She had hidden behind her books, her prayers, and her quiet smiles. But in the winter of that year, something within her snapped. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a cold, hard realization that settled in her marrow like the Russian frost.
She realized that in the brutal game of Romanov politics, there was no middle ground. You were either the hammer or you were the anvil. The epiphany of survival. The realization came during a humid summer evening when she overheard a conversation between her husband, Peter, and his inner circle of Holstein advisors. They were laughing, a crude, jagged sound that echoed through the palace vents. "When the old woman dies," Peter had sneered, referring to Empress Elizabeth, "the first thing I will do is send the German scholar to the Kolomna convent. I have already signed the order in my mind. Vorontsova will sit where Catherine sits." Catherine, standing in the shadows of the velvet curtains, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A convent. In Russia, a convent for a discarded royal wife was a living death, a place of gray stone, shorn hair, and a name erased from the world. At that moment, the spark was lit. It wasn't just a desire for power, it was the primitive, raw instinct for survival. "If I am to live," she whispered to the darkness, her fingers digging into the silk of her skirts, "I must rule. I will not be the victim of a fool." The gathering of the shadows. Catherine knew she couldn't fight a war with philosophy books. She needed iron. She needed boots on the ground. She needed the guards. The Imperial Guards, the Izmailovsky and Preobrazhensky regiments, were the kingmakers of Russia. They were men of salt, vodka, and fierce loyalty. They despised Peter. They saw him as a Prussian puppet who preferred the company of foreign soldiers to his own people. Catherine, on the other hand, had spent years carefully cultivating their respect. She began her clandestine campaign. She didn't meet them in ballrooms. She met them in the corners of gardens and through trusted intermediaries. "Tell the men," Catherine told her secret ally, Grigory Orlov, a man of charisma as dangerous as his sword, "that I do not seek a crown for myself. I seek a future for Russia that does not involve becoming a province of Prussia." It was a brilliant lie, or perhaps a half-truth. She was framing her rebellion not as a coup, but as an act of patriotism. The mask of the devout. While she plotted, her public behavior became even more impeccably Russian. This was the most critical part of the spark. She knew that to overthrow a czar, she had to be more czar-like than the heir himself. She attended every long, grueling Orthodox service. While Peter sat at the back, yawning and mocking the priests, Catherine stood for hours, her head bowed, her lips moving in silent prayer. The priests saw this, the soldiers saw this, the common people who caught glimpses of her began to whisper, "There is the true mother of Russia." The contrast was her greatest weapon. Peter was the foreigner who happened to be born a Romanov. Catherine was the Russian who happened to be born a Prussian. The secret cabinet. In the dead of night, her apartments became a war room. She surrounded herself with men like Nikita Panin, the brilliant, cynical diplomat, and the Orlov brothers. They were a motley crew of intellectuals and thugs, held together by one thing, the belief that Catherine was their only ticket to survival. "The Empress's health is failing," Panin warned her during a midnight meeting, the candlelight reflecting in his cold eyes. "When she breathes her last, Peter will move fast. If you are still in the palace when he is crowned, you are lost." Catherine looked at the map of St. Petersburg spread across her table. "Then we must not be in the palace. We must be at the barracks. We must be the ones who define the moment before the moment defines us." The first spark becomes a flame. The first spark finally caught fire during the midwinter festival.
a minor official, suspected of being loyal to Catherine, was arrested by Peter's private police. The rumor spread that Peter was preparing a list of traitors to be executed the moment he took the throne. Panic rippled through the court. This was exactly what Catherine needed. Fear is a powerful catalyst. She didn't have to convince people to join her. She only had to show them that Peter was a threat to their lives. She stopped being the quiet scholar. She began to speak with a new authority. When she walked through the corridors, she no longer looked at the floor. She looked the guards in the eye. She gave them small, knowing nods. "The time for books is over," she wrote in a final, frantic note to Voltaire, which she never sent. "Now I must write my own history in the language of steel." The weight of the choice. The psychological toll of this rebellion was heavy. Catherine was essentially planning to betray her husband and usurp the throne of her son's father. But the loveless bed had hardened her. She felt no guilt, only a cold, driving necessity. "I have crossed the Neva," Catherine told Grigory Orlov as they stood on the frozen riverbank, the ice groaning beneath them. "There is no turning back to the other side. Either I wear the crown or I wear the shroud." The dawn of the coup. As the chapter ends, the stage is set. The Empress Elizabeth is on her deathbed, her breathing shallow. Peter is already celebrating, drinking to his future reign. And Catherine is dressed in a simple dark traveling suit, her heart beating with the rhythm of a war drum. The spark of rebellion had traveled from her mind to her heart and finally to her hands. She was no longer a pawn, she was a revolutionary. "Let the world judge me," she whispered as she looked out at the dark silhouette of the Peterhof. "But let them judge me while I am sitting on the throne." The Orlov Alliance. The Enlightenment had given Catherine a mind for ruling, but the Orlovs gave her the hands to seize the throne. In the high-stakes theater of St. Petersburg, ideas are beautiful, but they are fragile. To survive a coup, you need more than philosophy. You need the raw, unrefined muscle of the barracks. And in the winter of 1760, that muscle took the form of the 5 Orlov brothers, a clan of giants who lived for gambling, brawling, and the thrill of the impossible. At their head was Grigory Orlov, a man of startling physical beauty and a recklessness that bordered on suicidal. The alliance did not begin in a throne room. It began in the humid, candle-lit corners of a masquerade ball. Catherine, dressed in a modest gown, found herself being watched by a man who did not bow with the sycophantic grace of the other courtiers. Grigory Orlov was a hero of the Battle of Zorndorf. He carried the scars of 3 musket balls in his flesh, and he walked with the swagger of a man who had stared into the mouth of a cannon and laughed. When their eyes met, Catherine did not see a servant. She saw a weapon. "Your Imperial Highness," Grigory whispered, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the air between them. "The guards are bored. They are tired of drilling for a man who loves Prussia. They are waiting for a reason to unsheathe their swords." Catherine leaned in, her fan fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. "And what reason would that be, Captain?" "A queen," he replied, "who is worth dying for." A clandestine affair. The romance that followed was not merely a matter of the heart, it was a matter of statecraft. Every kiss was a contract. Every night spent in the shadows of the Orlovs' quarters was a tactical briefing. Grigory and Alexei Orlov were the idols of the guards. They were the men who could drink a liter of vodka without blinking and win a fistfight against 3 opponents at once.
By taking Grigori as her lover, Catherine was doing more than finding comfort in a loveless life. She was embedding herself into the very fabric of the military. Through the Orlovs, Catherine became little mother to the common soldiers.
The danger of the alliance. But the Orlov alliance was a double-edged sword. Grigori was a man of passion, not a man of patience. He was prone to jealousy and outbursts of temper. Catherine had to manage him with the same delicacy she used with the Empress Elizabeth. She was walking a tightrope. If the affair was discovered too early, Peter would have a legal reason to execute her for adultery. If she didn't keep the Orlovs close enough, she would lose her only protection. "I am sleeping with a lion," Catherine wrote in a coded entry in her journal. "It is the only way to keep the wolves at bay. I must ensure the lion remains hungry for the throne, but loyal to me." The alliance reached its most perilous point when Catherine realized she was pregnant with Grigori's child. It was a crisis that could have ended her life. To hide the birth from Peter, her loyal valet set fire to his own house on the other side of the city. As Peter rushed out to watch the blaze, his favorite pastime, Catherine gave birth in secret to a son, Alexei Bobrinsky, who was immediately whisked away in a bundle of furs. The secret held. The bond with the Orlovs was now sealed in blood and birth. The trigger is cocked. By the time Empress Elizabeth breathed her last in late 1761, the Orlov alliance was complete. Catherine had the intellect, the Orlovs had the pikes and the pistols. As Peter III ascended the throne and immediately began his disastrous pro-Prussian reforms, the Orlovs moved through the taverns and the barracks like ghosts of the coming storm. They were ready. They were merely waiting for Catherine to drop the mask. "The muscle is ready, Yekaterina," Grigori whispered to her as she stood by the window, watching the snow fall over the Neva. "The guards are restless. The swords are sharpened. Give us the word, and we will hand you the world." Catherine looked at her hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. They were trembling with the realization that the hidden rain was about to become the only rain. "Soon," she replied, but not a moment before the clock strikes 12. The Orlov alliance had turned a discarded wife into a contender. It had provided the muscle that would soon crush the House of Romanov and rebuild it in her image. The spark of rebellion was now a raging fire, fueled by the passion and the violence of the Orlov brothers. The midnight coup. The air on the morning of June 28, 1762, did not taste of summer. It tasted of iron and impending rain. For Catherine, the hidden rain was over. The time for books, whispers, and secret lovers had expired. Now there was only the cold, hard reality of the bayonet. This is the minute-by-minute account of the day a minor German princess became the autocrat of all the Russias. 5 a.m. The shattered silence. The coup did not begin with a trumpet blast. It began with a frantic pounding on a wooden door. Catherine was asleep at the Peterhof Palace, miles away from the capital, when Alexei Orlov, the giant, scarred brother of her lover, burst into her bedchamber. He was covered in the dust of a hard gallop. "Matushka," he gasped, his voice raspy from the road. "Wake up! One of our men, Pasek, has been arrested. The secret is out. If we do not act this very hour, we are dead men." Catherine did not scream. She did not panic. She rose from her bed with the mechanical precision of a soldier. Within minutes, she was dressed in a simple black gown. She stepped into a nondescript carriage, her heart hammering a rhythm of war against her ribs. "To St. Petersburg," she commanded, "and do not spare the horses." 7:30 a.m. The road to sovereignty. As the carriage thundered toward the capital, Catherine sat in the dim light, watching the Russian countryside blur past. She was a woman on her way to a throne or an executioner's block. There was no middle ground. Halfway to the city, they met her lover, Grigory Orlov. He was waiting with fresh horses. There were no words exchanged, only a look of grim, desperate resolve. The Orlov alliance was now no theory. It was a moving wall of muscle protecting a queen. 9 a.m., the baptism of the guards. The carriage lurched to a halt at the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment. This was the moment of no return. Catherine stepped out of the carriage. She stood before the wall of soldiers, men who had been told to swear fealty to her husband, Peter III. She looked at their weathered faces, their confused eyes, and their gripped muskets. "Soldiers," her voice rang out, steady and clear as a bell. "I have come to you for protection. The Emperor has ordered my arrest. He intends to destroy me, and he intends to destroy Russia." For a heartbeat, there was silence. The world held its breath. Then a single sergeant stepped forward and fell to his knees. "Long live the Empress Catherine!" The shout was taken up by 100 throats, then 1,000. The spark of rebellion had become a wildfire. The regiment didn't just cheer, they surged forward to kiss the hem of her dress. The priests were brought out, a makeshift altar was raised, and beneath the gray morning sky, Catherine was declared sovereign. 11 a.m., the Cathedral of Power. By noon, Catherine reached the Kazan Cathedral in the heart of St. Petersburg. The streets were a sea of green uniforms and tossing plumes. The bells of the city began to toll, a frantic, joyous clanging that told the citizens their world had shifted on its axis. Inside the cathedral, the air was thick with incense. The Archbishop of St. Petersburg placed the cross in her hand. "By the grace of God and the will of the people," he intoned. Catherine stood before the icons, the light of 10,000 candles reflecting in her eyes. She was no longer a pawn. She was the law. But the coup was not yet finished. A crown is nothing without the palace. 2 p.m., the march on Peterhof. While Catherine was being hailed in the capital, her husband, Peter III, was at the Oranienbaum Palace, nursing a hangover and planning a feast. When the news reached him that his wife had seized the city, he did not prepare for battle. He collapsed. "She's a German girl," he stammered, his face pale as ash. "How can she take my guards?" Meanwhile, Catherine was doing something no Russian empress had ever done. She donned the uniform of the Preobrazhenskensky Guard, a man's tunic of emerald green. She mounted a white stallion named Brilliant. She drew her saber, its steel flashing in the sun, and she led 14,000 soldiers out of the city to hunt down her husband. She looked like a goddess of war. Beside her rode Princess Dashkova, her youngest and most brilliant conspirator, also in male uniform. Together, they were the new face of Russia, young, intellect-driven, and utterly ruthless. 8 p.m., the twilight of the Tsar. As the sun began to set, the imperial army reached the outskirts of Peterhof. Peter had fled to a small boat, hoping to escape to the fortress of Kronstadt, but when he arrived, the cannons were pointed at him.
"The Empress Catherine is in command," the sentries shouted across the water. "Move off, or we fire." The midnight coup had reached its psychological end. Peter returned to the shore, a broken man. He was forced to sign a document of abdication, a pathetic letter where he admitted he was unfit to rule and begged only to be allowed to keep his mistress and his violin. 11 p.m., the silence after the storm. As night fell over the palace, Catherine sat at a small desk. She was still wearing the soldier's uniform. Her boots were covered in mud. Her hair was windswept. She called for a glass of wine and a pen.
She wrote a single sentence to her advisers. The peace of the empire is restored. The usurper is contained. The midnight coup had reached its psychological end. Peter returned to the shore, a broken man. He was forced to sign a document of abdication, a pathetic letter where he admitted he was unfit to rule and begged only to be allowed to keep his mistress and his violin. 11 p.m. The silence after the storm. As night fell over the palace, Catherine sat at a small desk. She was still wearing the soldier's uniform. Her boots were covered in mud. Her hair was windswept. She called for a glass of wine and a pen. She wrote a single sentence to her advisers. The peace of the empire is restored. The usurper is contained. The day had begun with a knock on a bedroom door. It ended with Catherine as the sole ruler of the largest empire on earth. She had navigated the treacherous waters, survived the loveless bed, and used the Orlov muscle to execute the perfect revolution. The midnight coup was a masterpiece of timing and theater. Not a single drop of blood had been shed in the capital. The city had simply woken up and chosen a mother over a tyrant. But as Catherine looked out at the dark waters of the Neva, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Seizing a throne is an act of a day. Holding it is the work of a lifetime. The hidden reign was over. The great reign had begun. The widow's crown. A throne won in a day is often paid for in a lifetime of shadows. Catherine was now the empress, but the crown felt heavy, not with gold, but with the silent, lingering presence of the man she had displaced. Peter III was no longer an emperor, but as long as he breathed, he was a ghost that could haunt her legitimacy. The week following the coup was a blur of incense and ink. However, the air in St. Petersburg remained thick with a question no one dared to ask aloud. What do you do with the deposed Tsar? The prisoner of Ropsha. While Catherine was being hailed as a savior in the capital, Peter was moved to a country estate called Ropsha. He was under the protection of the Orlov brothers, specifically Alexei Orlov, the man with the scarred face and the iron grip. Peter's letters to Catherine from his confinement were pathetic. They were the scratches of a broken bird. He begged for his violin, his dog, and his mistress. He promised to never bother her again if she would only let him live out his days in the quiet of the country. Catherine did not answer. To answer was to acknowledge his existence, and in the cold mathematics of power, Peter's existence was a luxury the new empress could not afford. The widow's crown was being forged in the silence between her commands. The Dinner of Shadows. On July 17, 1762, only 8 days after her triumph, a messenger arrived at the palace. He was covered in mud, his face pale, his hands trembling as he handed a crumpled note to Catherine. The note was from Alexei Orlov. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged as if by sweat or tears. It claimed that Peter had gotten into a drunken brawl with his guards at dinner. It claimed that in the heat of the moment, an accident had occurred. Our monster has died of an imperial colic, the official report would later state. But the truth, whispered through the palace vents, was far different. The colic was a silk cord. The accident was a heavy hand around a throat. Peter III, the grandson of Peter the Great, was dead. The psychological weight of regicide. When Catherine received the news, she did not cheer. She collapsed into a chair, her face as white as the marble statues surrounding her. "My horror is at its height," she whispered to her closest confidant, Princess Dashkova. "I know what the world will say. They will say I am a Jezebel. They will say I paved my way to the throne with the blood of my husband. This was the true widow's crown. It wasn't just about losing a husband she never loved. It was about the eternal stain on her reputation. From the courts of Versailles to the coffee houses of London, the whispers began. The German girl killed the Tsar. She had to make a choice. She could punish the Orlovs and risk losing the military support that kept her alive, or she could protect them and carry the guilt of the murder for the rest of her life. She chose the latter. Power, she realized, often required the sacrifice of one's conscience. The funeral of ice. The funeral was a masterpiece of political theater. Peter's body was brought to the Alexandra Nevsky Monastery. To dispel rumors of foul play, the body was dressed in full uniform and laid in an open casket. Catherine did not attend the funeral. She claimed she was too overwhelmed by grief and illness. In reality, she could not face the man she had unmade. But the people of St. Petersburg filed past the casket in a grim, silent line. They saw the dark bruising around the neck, partially hidden by the high military collar. They knew, but they also knew that Catherine brought stability, while Peter had brought chaos. They traded their moral outrage for the promise of a golden age. The whispers of regicide became the background noise of her reign, always present but never loud enough to drown out the church bells. The coronation of the sole autocrat. In September, Catherine traveled to Moscow for her formal coronation. She wanted the crown of the Tsars to be placed on her head in the ancient heart of Russia. She wore a gown embroidered with the double-headed eagle. She walked into the Cathedral of the Assumption, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and holy oil. As she reached for the great imperial crown, a magnificent piece featuring nearly 5,000 diamonds, she didn't wait for the priest to place it on her head. Following the tradition of the autocrats, she took the crown in her own hands and crowned herself. It was a statement to the world. I hold this power not by the grace of a husband or the permission of a church. I hold it by my own will. Yet, as the heavy weight of the diamonds pressed down upon her brow, she felt the phantom touch of the widow's crown beneath it. She was the most powerful woman in the world, but she was also a woman who lived in a palace of ghosts. The legacy of the secret. The mysterious death of Peter III would haunt Catherine for 36 years. Every time a rebellion rose, every time a pretender claimed to be the miraculously escaped Peter, the old wounds would reopen. She spent the rest of her life trying to prove that she was worthy of the throne she had stolen. She built hospitals, she wrote laws, she expanded the borders of the empire. It was as if she was trying to outrun the shadow of that July afternoon at Rapsha. I have bought Russia's future with my own peace, she once told her diary. The crown is mine, but the price was the silence of the grave. The widow's crown was her first true lesson in the cost of the Enlightenment. You can read about justice in books, but to enact it in a land like Russia, you must sometimes be prepared to let the darkness do your work. The law of the autocrat. Catherine the Great did not believe that an empire should be held together merely by the whip. To her, the blood-stained widow's crown was a burden that could only be justified by a singular monumental achievement, the creation of a perfect system of justice. By 1766, she had been on the throne for 4 years. She had secured the borders, she had quieted the whispers of regicide, and now she turned her formidable intellect toward the soul of Russia itself. The result was the nakaz, the instruction, a document that would either become the foundation of a new civilization or the greatest literary tragedy of the 18th century, the architect of reason. For 18 months, Catherine became a hermit in her own palace. She rose at 5 in the morning, brewed
The serfdom paradox. The most painful realization for Catherine was the issue of serfdom. In her heart, the heart of the girl who had devoured the Enlightenment in secret, she knew that slavery was a cancer. To call a man a thing is a crime against God, she had written in her early drafts of the Nakaz. But as she listened to the commission, she realized the terrifying truth. The Russian nobility would let her change the religion, the language, and the map of the world, but they would never let her touch their souls. Their wealth and their status depended on the labor of the serfs. If she freed the peasants, the nobles who had put her on the throne would be the ones to drag her off it. The Nakaz was systematically gutted. Every clause that threatened the power of the landowners was crossed out by her advisors. Catherine watched as her dream of justice was slowly suffocated by the very people she sought to enlighten. The iron mask of the law. The commission dragged on for months, achieving nothing but noise. Eventually, the outbreak of war with the Ottoman Empire gave Catherine the excuse she needed to dissolve the assembly. The Nakaz was published, but it was a ghost of its former self. In France, the book was so radical that the king banned it. In Russia, it was so toothless that the nobles ignored it. This was the turning point in Catherine's psychology. She realized that to be a liberal in Russia was a luxury she could not afford if she wanted to remain the great. She began to understand that the autocrat's law was not about freedom, it was about order. "I am an aristocrat by trade," she later remarked with a bitter smile. "My heart may belong to the philosophers, but my crown belongs to the Russian soil." The legacy of the pen. Though the Grand Commission failed, the Nakaz remained a symbol. It was the first time a Russian ruler had ever acknowledged that the people had rights. It set a standard of intellectualism that would haunt the Romanov dynasty until its final days. Catherine had attempted to rewrite the DNA of an empire. She had failed to free the serfs, but she had succeeded in creating a new language of power. She had proven that she was not just a woman who had seized a throne, but a sovereign who had a vision for what a nation could be. As she tucked the original manuscript of the Nakaz into her private archives, she knew that the law of the autocrat would always be a compromise. Russia was a wild, unruly beast, and for now, the only way to lead it was to hold the reins tight with one hand, while the other held the pen. The Enlightenment had met its match in the Russian winter. The dream was deferred, but the Empress was no longer a dreamer. She was a realist, and a realist with an empire is the most dangerous person of all. The Pugachev storm. The Enlightenment was a dream of the salon, but the Pugachev storm was a nightmare of the steppe. For years, Catherine had corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe about justice and liberty. However, in 1773, the reality of Russia struck back with a violence that turned her ink into blood. Deep in the Ural Mountains, amidst the salt-crusted air and the boundless grasslands, a fire was ignited. It was not a fire of philosophy, but of fury. A man had appeared from the shadows, a Cossack with a scarred face and eyes like burning coals. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev, but to the thousands of desperate serfs who flocked to his banner, he was a ghost returned to claim his due. He claimed to be Peter III, the husband Catherine had supposedly buried a decade ago. The return of the ghost. The rumors spread like a plague through the villages. "The Father Tsar is not dead," the peasants whispered over their wooden bowls.
He has survived the German woman's poison. He is coming to free us from the chains of the landlords. For Catherine, the news was a psychological thunderclap. She knew better than anyone that Peter III was dead. His body had been laid in an open casket for all to see. But in the vast, illiterate heart of Russia, a miracle was more believable than a murder. "They do not want a king," she remarked to her council, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and disdain. "This Cossack is giving them a reason to burn my world down." The river of blood. The Pugachev rebellion was not a protest, it was an apocalypse. He promised the end of taxes, the end of military service, and the execution of every noble in the empire. The violence was primal. Manor houses were torched, their libraries, the very symbols of Catherine's enlightenment, turned to ash. Landlords were strung up from their own gateposts. The rebellion grew from a few hundred Cossacks to an army of tens of thousands. Bashkirs, Tatars, and factory serfs joined the swarm. As the rebels marched toward the Volga, the storm reached its peak. Entire cities fell. The air in St. Petersburg grew heavy with the smell of distant smoke. For the first time since the coup of 1762, the ground beneath Catherine's throne felt unsteady. The Empress's iron fist. The law of the autocrat, which we explored in the previous chapter, was now a useless piece of parchment. Catherine realized that you cannot debate with a whirlwind. To save the Enlightenment, she would have to become a tyrant. "I have spent 10 years trying to be a mother to this nation, but children who burn their nursery must be whipped. If I do not crush this man, there will be no Russia left to rule." She summoned her best generals. She recalled her veterans from the Turkish front. The orders were simple and brutal. No mercy. This was no longer a war of borders. It was a war of class. It was the hidden rain facing the rising scythe. The psychological siege. The most terrifying aspect for Catherine was the deception. Every time Pugachev signed a decree as Peter III, it was a reminder of her original sin, the regicide. The widow's crown was pulsing on her brow. She began to doubt her own people. Did they love her, or were they merely waiting for a ghost to tell them it was okay to kill her? She retreated into the Hermitage, surrounding herself with more guards, more spies, and the comforting, silent presence of her books. But the books provided no answer for a rebellion built on a lie. The fall of the pretender. The tide turned in 1774. The imperial army, led by the iron-willed General Suvorov, finally cornered the rebel forces. The storm had spent its energy. Pugachev's own men, seeing the end was near, betrayed him. The Tsar of the peasants was brought to Moscow in an iron cage. Catherine refused to meet him. She didn't want to see the face of the man who had worn her husband's name. From her palace, she monitored the trial. Pugachev was sentenced to quartering, his limbs torn apart while still alive. In a final act of enlightened mercy, which was perhaps a way to cleanse her own guilt, Catherine secretly ordered the executioner to behead him first, before the quartering began. It was a cold, quiet mercy in a very loud, very bloody war. The ashes of the dream. The rebellion was over, but the storm had changed Catherine forever. The girl who had dreamed of freeing the serfs was dead. The woman who emerged was a hardened autocrat.
She realized that the Russian people were not ready for the social contract. She tightened the laws of serfdom. She gave the nobles even more power over their peasants as a reward for their loyalty. The serfdom paradox had been solved by choosing stability over justice. I have seen the face of the Russian mob, she mused, as she watched the winter snow cover the execution square. It is a face of fire. My task is not to set them free, it is to keep the fire contained. The Pugachev storm was the end of Catherine's innocence. It was the moment the great was earned, not through philosophy, but through the survival of a brutal, bloody winter. The ghost of Peter III was finally laid to rest, not in a grave, but in the charred ruins of the Russian heartland. Potemkin, the partner in power. The throne of Russia is a solitary peak, cold, windswept, and crowded with the ghosts of those who fell trying to reach it. For years, Catherine had occupied that peak alone. She had used the Orlovs for their muscle and the philosophers for their wisdom, but she had never found an equal, a mind that could match her fire and a heart that could withstand her ambition. Then came Grigory Potemkin. He was a man who defied the neat categories of the Enlightenment. He was a giant with one eye, a messy mane of hair, and a soul that swung violently between religious mysticism and raw political genius. If the midnight coup gave Catherine the crown, Potemkin gave her the empire. The Knight with the Broken Plume. Their story began on the day of the coup in 1762. As Catherine sat on her white horse, brilliant, she realized she was missing a sword knot, a minor but vital piece of military regalia. A young, dashing, non-commissioned officer stepped forward, his horse dancing beneath him. He handed her his own knot with a flourish that was both humble and incredibly bold. That was Potemkin. Catherine never forgot the look in his eye, a mixture of adoration and audacity. He was the only one, Catherine would later whisper to her letters, who did not look at me as a woman to be served or a sovereign to be feared, but as a destiny to be shared. The storm and the sovereign. It wasn't until the aftermath of the Pugachev storm that their bond truly ignited. Catherine was exhausted, her dreams of legal reform were in ashes, and her heart was weary of the Orlovs' possessive grip. Potemkin arrived at court like a thunderstorm. He was brilliant, erratic, and deeply Russian. He would spend days in his dressing room, biting his nails and reading theology. Then, in a sudden burst of energy, he would reorganize an entire army or design a city from the mud. Their romance was a collision of two suns. It was passionate, yes, filled with secret notes and midnight meetings in the Hermitage, but it was primarily an intellectual marriage. They called each other twin souls. In a court of sycophants, Potemkin was the only one who dared to argue with her, to shout at her, and to challenge her vision for Russia. The secret union. The whispers of St. Petersburg suggest that in the winter of 1774, in a small, candle-lit church, Catherine and Potemkin were secretly married. Whether the priest truly spoke the vows or not, the reality was clear. Potemkin was no longer a favorite. He was the prince of the Holy Roman Empire, the commander-in-chief, and the architect of Catherine's grandest dreams. "My dear husband," she addressed him in her private letters, "we are two halves of a single mind. What I think, you execute. What you dream, I fund." The conquest of the South. Potemkin's greatest gift to Catherine was the Greek project, the dream of driving the Ottomans out of Europe and reclaiming Constantinople. He didn't just talk about expansion, he built it. He took the wild, lawless steppes of the South and transformed them into new Russia. He annexed the Crimea without firing a single shot of major war, simply through a masterclass of psychological pressure and diplomacy. He built the Black Sea Fleet from nothing. When the world doubted his progress, he invited Catherine on a legendary journey to the South in 1787. This was the origin of the Potemkin village myth, the idea that he built cardboard facades to fool her. In truth, the cities he built, Sevastopol, Kherson, and Nikolaev, were very real. They were the anchors of a new superpower.
"You have given me the sea," Catherine told him as they stood on the cliffs of the Crimea, watching the sun set over the new Russian fleet. "And in so doing, you have made Russia immortal." Lovers to partners. The tragedy of their bond was that their passions were too great for a single bedroom. Eventually, the physical romance faded, replaced by a complex political partnership. They both took other lovers, yet no one could enter their inner circle without Potemkin's approval. He became their manager of favorites. He would vet the young men who sought Catherine's attention, ensuring they were intellectually harmless and politically loyal. "Our love has changed its skin," Potemkin wrote to her during one of his long absences in the south, "but the bone and the marrow remain. I am your creature, and you are my God." The empty chair. When Potemkin died in 1791 on a lonely stretch of road in the middle of the steppe he had conquered, Catherine's world collapsed. When the news reached her, she fell into a state of grief so profound that the court feared for her life. She wept for days, refusing to eat. "Now I have no one to lean on," she cried. "A great man has gone, a man who was mine and whom I made." The partner in power was gone. For the remaining 5 years of her life, Catherine ruled with a heavy heart. She continued their projects, she defended their borders, but the spark was dimmed. Potemkin had been her mirror. Without him, she was just an old woman in a very large palace. The legacy of the match. The Potemkin-Catherine alliance remains the most successful political partnership in history. Together, they shifted the gravity of Europe. They brought the Enlightenment to the Black Sea and the Russian flag to the Mediterranean. He was the muscle and the vision. She was the will and the crown. They never taught you this in the history books. They taught you of her lovers as a scandal, but they failed to tell you that one of those lovers was the co-author of an empire.
The Southern Strategy. To make the dream a reality, Catherine and Potemkin turned the southern steppes into a massive military shipyard. They built the Black Sea Fleet from nothing. Cities like Sevastopol and Kherson were raised from the mud, designed with neoclassical columns to mimic the grandeur of ancient Athens. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, was now the sick man. Catherine smelled the decay. She pushed her armies toward the Danube, her generals, like the legendary Suvorov, fighting with a religious fervor. "Every victory brings us closer to the domes of St. Sophia," the soldiers would shout. The Greek project was the ideology that turned a territorial war into a crusade. The journey to the sun. The climax of this vision was the legendary 1787 trip to the Crimea. Catherine traveled in a massive fleet of gilded galleys down the Dnieper River. It was a spectacle of power that left the foreign ambassadors speechless. Along the riverbanks, Potemkin arranged displays of prosperity, the famous villages that were more than just facades. They were the proof of a new Russian reality. At night, the hills were lit with massive firework displays that spelled out the word Constantinople in the sky. Catherine stood on the deck of her ship, wrapped in sables, looking toward the horizon. "This is not just a journey," she told the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, who accompanied her. "This is the dawn of a new Rome." The price of ambition. But the map of Europe did not bend easily. The Greek project terrified Great Britain and Prussia. They saw Catherine as a colossus who was about to swallow the Mediterranean. The resistance was fierce. The wars were long, bloody, and drained the imperial treasury. For every mile of southern soil gained, thousands of Russian lives were lost in the marshes of the Danube. The enlightened empress was now accused of being a warmonger, a woman whose passion for history had blinded her to the suffering of her own people. The unfinished dream. The dream of Constantinople was never fully realized.
The internal rot of the Ottoman Empire was slower than Catherine's ambition was fast. When Potemkin died, the Greek project lost its architect. However, Catherine had succeeded in something nearly as monumental. She had annexed the Crimea, secured the Black Sea, and made Russia a Mediterranean power for the first time in history. She didn't get Constantinople, but she got the gateway to it. "I have planted the seeds," she mused in her final years, looking at a map of the Balkans. "Others will harvest the fruit, but let them remember, I was the one who dared to dream in Greek." The Greek project remains a testament to the hidden reign, a reminder that Catherine was not just a player in the Game of Thrones, she was the one rewriting the rules of the world. Behind the velvet curtain. History has a way of turning powerful women into caricatures, and for Catherine the Great, the curtain of time has been draped with 1,000 scandals. For centuries, whispers have echoed through the halls of European courts, tales of a private museum hidden deep within the Winter Palace, a secret chamber of depravity that defined her intimate life. But as we step behind the velvet curtain, we find the truth to be far more complex, more human, and arguably more tragic than the myth. The architecture of scandal. The rumors were not accidental. They were the weapons of her enemies, men in Paris, London, and Berlin who could not reconcile a woman's political genius with her biological desires. To the patriarchal minds of the 18th century, if a woman ruled like a man, she must surely lust like a monster. "They cannot defeat my armies," she once remarked to her confidant, Princess Dashkova, "so they attempt to defeat my reputation. They invent rooms I have never entered and appetites I have never known." The private museum was, in reality, her hermitage. It was not a den of vice, but a sanctuary of the mind. It was a place where she collected thousands of paintings, ancient cameos, and rare manuscripts. While the world whispered of erotic furniture, Catherine was actually spending her nights cataloging the largest art collection in Europe. The scandal wasn't what she was doing with her body, it was what she was doing with her brain. The system of favorites. However, to say she was a prude would be another lie. Her intimate life was governed by a strict, almost bureaucratic system of favorites. She was a woman who hated loneliness. She required a partner, someone to talk to, someone to share her bed, and someone to provide the emotional warmth that her marriage to Peter III so brutally lacked. The process of becoming a favorite was a ritual of the state. A young man would be noticed by the Empress, he would then be vetted by Potemkin, and finally he would be examined by a trusted lady-in-waiting to ensure his health and intellect were up to the imperial standard. "I need a man who can speak to me of Voltaire as easily as he can hold me in the dark," she wrote. But as she aged, the men grew younger, and the intellectual gap grew wider. This was the tragedy of the velvet curtain. She was looking for a peer, but she often found only sycophants who wanted her gold more than her heart. The reality of intimacy. Behind the curtain, Catherine was not a predator. She was a serial monogamist. She was deeply, almost pathetically devoted to the man of the moment. She would shower them with titles, palaces, and thousands of serfs. When a relationship ended, usually because the young man could not handle the pressure of the court, she would weep for days, her heart breaking with the same intensity as a common girl's. The scandals they never taught you were not about her wildness, they were about her vulnerability. She was the autocrat of all the Russias, yet she was a prisoner of her own need for affection. She wanted to be loved for Sophie, the girl from Zerbst, but she could only be approached as Catherine, the Empress of the North. The myth of the horse. We must address the most persistent and malicious lie of all, the myth of the horse. This grotesque fabrication was created by French revolutionaries years after her death to defeminize her.
There is no historical evidence, not a single shred, to support such a claim. It was the ultimate insult to suggest that a woman of her intellect was nothing more than a beast. A woman who thinks is an enemy, Catherine mused in her diary. A woman who rules is a target. The legacy of the private life. When we pull back the velvet curtain, we find a woman who lived a life of extraordinary discipline. Her private museum was her legacy of culture, the foundation of what is now the State Hermitage Museum. Her intimate life was a series of attempts to fill a void left by power. She died not in a secret chamber of scandal, but at her desk, with a pen in her hand and a half-finished decree before her. The reality of Catherine's life was not her passion for men, it was her passion for Russia. The scandals were the noise, the rain was the music.
The patron of the arts. Catherine the Great understood a truth that many monarchs forget. Armies can conquer territory, but only art can conquer time. When she seized the throne, St. Petersburg was a city of stone and swamp, impressive in scale, but hollow in soul. By the time she died, it was the cultural jewel of the world, a city that did not merely imitate Paris and London, it rivaled them. This was not a project of vanity. For Catherine, the acquisition of art was a geopolitical statement. It was a declaration to the traditional powers of Europe that Russia had arrived, not as a barbarian horde, but as the new guardian of civilization. The birth of the Hermitage. The patron of the arts was born out of a moment of diplomatic spite. In 1764, a Berlin merchant named Gotskowski owed a debt to the Russian crown. To pay it, he offered a collection of 225 paintings that had originally been intended for King Frederick of Prussia. Catherine didn't just accept the paintings, she seized the opportunity to humiliate Frederick. She bought them all. She then realized that these masterpieces needed a home. She commissioned a small private wing of the Winter Palace to house them, a place where she could retreat from the vultures of the court. She called it her Hermitage. "It is not for the public," she wrote with a smirk to her friend Melchior Grimm. "Only the mice and I can admire these. But the world will know that what Frederick could not afford, Catherine has bought with gold and iron." The glutton of culture. Catherine's appetite for art soon became legendary and insatiable. She didn't just buy individual paintings, she bought entire collections. When the great French philosopher Diderot fell into poverty, Catherine did more than send him charity. She bought his entire library, then paid him a salary to act as her librarian, allowing him to keep the books in Paris until his death. She dispatched agents to every auction house in Europe. From the shores of Britain to the villas of Italy, the word went out, the Empress of the North is buying. She acquired the Walpole collection from England, the Crozat collection from France, and thousands of carved gems, cameos, and sculptures. She was building a museum of the world in the middle of a frozen tundra. "I am not a collector," she once mused while inspecting a Rembrandt. "I am an accumulator of human genius. If I cannot bring the Russian people to Europe, I will bring Europe to the Russian people." Architectural alchemy. The transformation of St. Petersburg required more than canvases, it required stone. Catherine loathed the fussy Baroque style of her predecessor Elizabeth. She wanted the city to reflect the Enlightenment, order, symmetry, and neoclassical grandeur. She invited the finest architects from Italy and France, men like Quarengi and Falconet. Under her direction, the Neva River was lined with granite embankments that shimmered like silver in the moonlight. She commissioned the Bronze Horseman, the magnificent statue of Peter the Great, which remains the symbol of the city to this day. Every building was a lesson in geometry and power. She wanted the courtiers to feel small beneath the towering columns of the marble palace, and the foreign ambassadors to feel a sense of awe as they walked through the halls of the great Hermitage. the literary salon of the North. Art, to Catherine, was not silent. She turned the court into a massive literary salon. She wrote plays, edited journals, and corresponded with the greatest minds of the age, Voltaire, Diderot, and d'Alembert. She turned St. Petersburg into a sanctuary for ideas that were being censored in their own homelands. While the French king was burning books, Catherine was publishing them. She established the first public library in Russia and the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded higher education institution for women in Europe. A nation that reads is a nation that cannot be easily enslaved, she argued, though she carefully curated exactly what they were allowed to read. The paradox of the patron. There was, however, a dark irony to her patronage. The gold used to buy Rembrandts and Rubens came from the sweat of millions of serfs who would never see a painting in their lives. The marble columns of her palaces were carved by men who lived in hovels. This was the velvet paradox. Catherine was building a cultural paradise on a foundation of human bondage. She wanted to be the Minerva of the North, but she was a Minerva who held a scepter in one hand and a whip in the other. "My museum is a temple," she said, but for the Russian peasant it was a tomb of their labor. The immortal city. By the end of her reign, the transformation was complete. St. Petersburg was no longer a military outpost, it was a cultural superpower. She had successfully translated the Renaissance and the Enlightenment into the Russian tongue. When we walk through the Hermitage today, we are walking through Catherine's mind. Every painting, every statue, and every granite block is a piece of her autobiography. She didn't just rule Russia, she curated it. Paris may have the past, London may have the trade, but St. Petersburg has the future, because I have built it to last as long as beauty itself. The patron of the arts had achieved the impossible. She had made the Russian soul visible to the world, and in doing so, she ensured that the hidden reign of Catherine would never truly be forgotten. The serfdom paradox. The Enlightenment was a philosophy of light, but the foundation of the Russian Empire was built in the dark, damp earth of human bondage. This is the serfdom paradox, the jagged, irreconcilable fracture between Catherine the Great's soaring intellect and the brutal reality of the millions who lived as property under her crown. Catherine began her reign as a dreamer. She ended it as a realist. In between lies the story of a woman who wanted to be a liberator but discovered that in Russia the price of liberty was often the throne itself. The young reformer's dream. In her early years, Catherine's notebooks were filled with the fiery rhetoric of the French philosophes. She believed, with the conviction of a convert, that slavery was not only a moral stain, but an economic disaster. It is contrary to the Christian religion and to justice to make slaves of men, she wrote in her private memoirs. A person is not a thing, a person is a soul. When she took the throne, she genuinely intended to break the chains. She proposed laws to limit the power of landlords. She encouraged the press to discuss the peasant question, and she even held an essay contest on the benefits of freeing the serfs. To the scholars in Paris, Catherine was the morning star of freedom. But in the villages of the Volga and the wheat fields of the Ukraine, the morning star never rose. The wall of iron. The paradox began to tighten its grip during the Great Commission of 1767. Catherine presented her nakaz, which contained whispers of emancipation, but the response from the Russian nobility, the very men who had placed the crown on her head, was a wall of icy resistance. The nobles did not see serfs as souls. They saw them as souls in the tax accounting sense, units of labor, collateral for loans, and the source of their lavish lifestyles in St. Petersburg. "Your Majesty," a high-ranking count told her in a private audience, his voice devoid of emotion, "you may rule the map,
but we rule the land. If you take away our serfs, you take away our loyalty, and without our loyalty, whose guards will stand at your door?" This was the cold mathematics of survival. Catherine realized that to free the serfs was to commit political suicide. She was a Prussian pawn who had become an empress, but she was still a prisoner of the class that kept her in power. The expanding chain. As the years passed, the paradox turned into a tragedy of unintended consequences. To fund her grand wars, her Greek project, and her patronage of the arts, Catherine needed the support of the nobility more than ever. Instead of loosening the chains, she tightened them. She passed laws that forbade serfs from complaining about their masters directly to the throne. She gave away hundreds of thousands of state peasants who had some degree of freedom to her private favorites and generals, turning them into private slaves. Under her reign, serfdom did not shrink, it expanded. It became more institutionalized, more efficient, and more heartless. "I am the autocrat," she lamented to her diary, "yet I am the only person in Russia who is not free to do what is right." The ghost of the whip. The human cost of this paradox was staggering. While Catherine was debating Voltaire about the rights of man, a Russian landlord could legally sell a father to one estate and his children to another. Serfs could be traded for hunting dogs or lost in a game of cards. The Pugachev storm, as we explored in Chapter 10, was the violent scream of this oppressed class. But even after the rebellion was crushed, Catherine did not return to her reformist roots. Fear had replaced her idealism.
Writings on reform. She became a reactionary, fearful that even the mention of freedom would set her empire on fire. "I was a fool to think that ideas could change a heart of stone," she told her secretary. "Russia is a land of extremes. There is no middle ground between the whip and the chaos." The legacy of the paradox. The serfdom paradox is the shadow that follows the golden age of Catherine. She gave Russia a soul of art and a body of empire, but she left its heart in chains. It would take another 100 years and a bloody Crimean War for her descendant, Alexander II, to finally do what Catherine could not. She remains a figure of profound contradiction, the most enlightened ruler of her age, who oversaw the darkest era of Russian slavery. "They never taught you this," the narrator might conclude, "that the greatest scandal of her reign was not a lover in her bed, but the millions of invisible men and women whose labor bought the diamonds in her crown." The mother of modern Russia. If the serfdom paradox was the shadow of her reign, then her commitment to science and education was its blinding light. Catherine the Great did not wish to merely expand Russia's borders, she wished to expand the Russian lifespan. In an age where superstition was the primary doctor, Catherine dared to use her own body as a laboratory for the future. This is the story of how a German-born empress became the mother of a modern nation, not through the sword, but through the syringe and the schoolhouse. The invisible assassin, smallpox. In the 18th century, the greatest threat to the Romanov dynasty was not a palace coup or a Prussian army, it was the speckled monster, smallpox. It was a disease that knew no borders and respected no crowns. It had claimed the life of the young Tsar Peter II and had left Catherine's own husband, Peter III, scarred and disfigured. By 1768, the plague was ravaging St. Petersburg. The court was in a state of panic. The traditional remedy was prayer and isolation, but Catherine had been reading the reports from England. She had heard of a radical, terrifying new technique called variolation, the deliberate infection of a healthy person with a small amount of the disease to trigger immunity. The people are afraid, her advisors warned her. The priests say it is tempting God. If you force this on the subjects, they will riot. Catherine looked at them with the cold clarity of a scientist. Then I will not force it on the subjects first. I will force it on myself. The ultimate gamble. It was a breathtaking move of courage. If she died from the inoculation, her enemies would claim she was a fool who committed suicide. If she lived, she would change the course of medical history. In secret, she summoned a British doctor, Thomas Dimsdale. On a cold October night, in the dead of silence, Dimsdale made a small incision in the Empress's arm and introduced the live virus. For several days, Catherine lay in a fever. The palace held its breath. The widow's crown hung in the balance. But Catherine was a survivor. She emerged from her chambers not only healthy, but immune. My objective was, by my example, to save from death the multitude of my subjects who do not know the value of this technique. She didn't stop with herself. She had her son and heir, Paul, inoculated immediately. Then she launched a massive, empire-wide vaccination campaign. She turned a medical procedure into a patriotic duty. She was the first ruler in history to treat public health as a cornerstone of national security. The architect of the Russian mind. But saving bodies was only half the battle. Catherine wanted to save minds. When she looked at Russia, she saw a vast, illiterate sea. She realized that if she wanted the Enlightenment to take root, she had to plant it in the children. She founded the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded higher education institution for women in all of Europe. This was a radical act. In an era where most European thinkers believed women were incapable of complex thought, Catherine was training the daughters of the nobility to be linguists, musicians, and scientists. I want to create a new race of people, men and women who are governed by reason, not by the whip of the landlord or the superstition of the monk. She established a network of primary and secondary schools in every provincial capital. She standardized textbooks and mandated that teachers be trained in modern methods. She was building the software of empire, an educated bureaucracy that would keep Russia functioning long after she was gone. The mother of schools. Catherine often visited the schools herself. She would sit in the back of the classrooms, listening to the children recite their lessons. She was not the great empress there. She was the little mother. She understood that education was the only way to eventually bridge the gap of the serfdom paradox. She knew she couldn't free the serfs in 1767, but she believed that if she educated their children, the chains would eventually rust away on their own. Knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken away from a person. It is the only true wealth, she told a group of students at Smolny. The legacy of progress. The mother of modern Russia was perhaps the most authentic version of Catherine. Here, she wasn't playing the Game of Thrones or the game of lovers. She was playing the game of civilization. By the end of her reign, the death rate from smallpox had plummeted. The first generation of educated Russian women was entering society. She had laid the groundwork for the great Russian intellectual explosion of the 19th century, the era of Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Turgenev. They will remember my wars, and they will whisper of my favorites, but every child who lives because of the medicine I brought, and every girl who reads because of the school I built, that is my true reign. The Great Expansion. Catherine the Great did not just inhabit Russia, she expanded it until the maps of Europe had to be redrawn in her image. If the mother of modern Russia was about the spirit, then the Great Expansion was about the bone and the marrow of power. Through a combination of brilliant diplomacy, the ink, and ruthless warfare, the blood, She added over 200,000 square miles to her empire. She did not seek territory for vanity, she sought it for destiny. She wanted to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake and the heart of Europe into a Russian sphere of influence. The conquest of the South, annexing Crimea. For centuries, the Crimean Peninsula was the dagger at the throat of Russia. It was the stronghold of the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire that sent raiding parties into the Russian heartland. To Catherine, the Crimea was not just strategic, it was the gateway to the Greek project, as we explored in Chapter 12. In 1783, Catherine and Potemkin decided that the time for buffer states was over. In a move that shocked the European courts, she annexed Crimea without a formal declaration of war. "I have taken what was already ours by the logic of geography," she wrote to Joseph II of Austria. Through the ink of a secret manifesto, she declared the peninsula part of the Russian Empire. Then came the blood. She sent her favorite, Potemkin, to secure the land. He didn't just conquer, he built. He turned a wild, pirate-infested coast into the base for the Black Sea Fleet. When the Turkish Sultan protested, Catherine pointed to her cannons. The dagger had been turned around, and it was now pointed at Constantinople.
The partitioning of Poland, the ink of betrayal. While the South was won with cannons, the West was won with a pen. Poland, once a great power, had become a fractured, weak state. Catherine saw it not as a neighbor, but as a dinner to be shared with Prussia and Austria. The partitioning of Poland remains one of the most controversial acts of her reign. She did not want to conquer Poland outright. She wanted it to be a Russian puppet. She even placed her former lover, Stanislaw Poniatowski, on the Polish throne. "I have given them a king," she remarked cynically. "Now I shall give them the law." But when the Polish people rose in rebellion to defend their independence, Catherine's ink turned to blood. Between 1772 and 1795, in 3 successive partitions, she systematically wiped Poland off the map. She carved away the vast territories of Lithuania, Belarus, and western Ukraine. By the time she was finished, Poland had ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Forging the empire, blood and ink. The expansion was a masterpiece of realpolitik. Catherine played the great powers against each other. She used the ink of treaties to isolate her enemies and the blood of her soldiers to seal the deals. Her generals, Suvorov and Potemkin, became the architects of this new world. They fought in the snows of the north and the heat of the south. But behind every bayonet was Catherine's focused, unyielding will. "I am an empress of my word," she told the French ambassador, "but my word is backed by 200,000 muskets. It is much easier to negotiate when the other side is looking at a fortress." The cost of greatness. The expansion made Russia a colossus. It brought millions of new subjects under her rule, Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, creating the multi-ethnic empire that would define the 19th century. But the cost was high. The constant warfare drained the treasury, leading to inflation and the serfdom paradox from Chapter 15. The more she expanded the empire's borders, the more she had to oppress the people within them to pay for it. Furthermore, the destruction of Poland created a Polish question that would haunt the Romanovs for 100 years. She had gained land, but she had planted the seeds of eternal rebellion. The map of the mind. Toward the end of her life, Catherine would often sit in her study, tracing the new borders of Russia on a massive globe. She had pushed the empire to the Black Sea, the Dniester River, and deep into the heart of Europe. "I began with a crown that was contested. I end with an empire that is undisputed."
She had transformed Russia from a northern curiosity into the arbiter of European affairs. She had used the blood of her people to buy the ink of history. The Great Expansion was not just about land, it was about the realization of the Prussian pawn's ultimate ambition, to be the most powerful person on earth. The French shadow. For 30 years, Catherine the Great had played a sophisticated game of intellectual flirtation with the radical thinkers of France. She was the Semiramis of the North, the pen pal of Voltaire, and the patron of Diderot. She had prided herself on being the most enlightened sovereign in Europe. But in 1789, the light she had so admired in Paris turned into a forest fire that threatened to consume every throne in the world. The French Revolution was more than a political event. It was a shadow that fell over Catherine's soul. It was the moment the liberal empress realized that the ideas she had toyed with in her library were the very same ideas that were now sharpening the blade of the guillotine. The news from Paris, the crack in the mirror. The news of the fall of the Bastille arrived in St. Petersburg like a thunderclap. At first, Catherine dismissed it as the usual French instability, but as the reports grew darker, as the Declaration of the Rights of Man was published and the streets of Paris ran red, her curiosity turned to horror. "The French disease is more contagious than smallpox," she remarked to her council, her voice devoid of its usual wit, "and medicine for the mind is far harder to find." The French shadow began to stretch across the Neva. Catherine, who once encouraged the translation of French philosophy, now saw every book as a potential bomb. She realized that the social contract was not a gentlemanly agreement, it was a death warrant for monarchs. The execution of a king, the point of no return. The ultimate breaking point came in January 1793 with the execution of King Louis XVI. When the news reached Catherine that a fellow sovereign had been beheaded by his own people, she took to her bed for 3 days in mourning. It was not out of love for Louis, whom she had often found weak. It was out of fear for the institution of monarchy itself. From this moment on, she wrote in a decree, the term citizen is a profanity. We are subjects of the Almighty and the autocrat, or we are nothing. The liberal empress vanished. In her place stood a cautious reactionary. She ordered a total blockade of French goods. She burned the books of the very men she had once funded. She even ordered that every Frenchman in Russia swear a public oath of hatred against the revolution or face immediate expulsion. The hunt for the Russian Jacobins. The shadow didn't just fall on foreigners, it fell on her own people. Catherine became convinced that the French fever was spreading among the Russian intelligentsia. She turned her secret police, the secret chancellery, against the men she had once inspired. Alexander Radishev, a writer who published a scathing critique of serfdom in his Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, became her first victim. Years earlier, Catherine might have debated him. Now she branded him a rebel worse than Pugachev. "He speaks of liberty while the world is burning," she hissed as she signed his exile to Siberia. "There is no liberty in a graveyard." She silenced the printing presses. She banned private travel to Europe. She created an intellectual iron curtain 40 years before the term existed. The woman who had built the Smolny Institute for Girls was now afraid that education was the fuel for rebellion. The betrayal of the Enlightenment. The tragedy of the French shadow was that it forced Catherine to betray her younger self. She looked at her early drafts of the Nakaz, with its talk of rights and legal equality, and saw them as the mistakes of a naive girl. She blamed the philosophers. She blamed Voltaire for the mobs in Paris. She felt that they had sold her a dream of reason that had resulted in the reality of the reign of terror. Philosophy is a fine thing in a book, she told her secretary, but it is a terrible thing in the hands of a man who has not eaten for 3 days. I have spent my life building a civilization. I will not let it be torn down by a slogan. The final fortress. By 1795, the French shadow had turned Catherine into a prisoner of her own power. She surrounded herself with guards and sycophants who told her only what she wanted to hear. She grew suspicious, bitter, and isolated. She had won the Great Expansion, as seen in Chapter 17, but she was losing the war for the Russian soul. She had made Russia a superpower, but she had turned it into a fortress where the windows were barred and the doors were bolted. I have become what I once feared, she mused as she looked at a portrait of the executed Marie Antoinette. I am the wall that stands between Russia and the abyss. If the wall is hard, it is because the abyss is deep. The liberal empress was gone. The great Catherine remained. But she was a woman who no longer believed in the perfectibility of man. She believed only in the necessity of the crown. The dynasty's weight. Power is a jealous mistress. It demands everything and often leaves the heart bankrupt. As Catherine entered the twilight of her reign, she realized that she had conquered empires, rewritten laws, and outsmarted kings, yet she had failed to conquer the one thing that mattered most for the future, the heart of her own son. This is the story of the dynasty's weight, the suffocating friction between a mother who was a titan and a son who felt like a ghost in her shadow. Paul I was not merely an heir, he was a living reminder of the widow's crown and the original sin of 1762. The shadow of the father. The tragedy of Paul began with his face. As he grew, he looked more and more like the murdered Peter III, the same receding chin, the same bulging eyes, and the same frantic, nervous energy. To Catherine, looking at her son was like looking at a ghost that refused to be buried. "He does not have the soul of a Romanov," she whispered to Potemkin. "He has the neurosis of a Holstein."
The Siege of Gatchina. Catherine eventually banished Paul to the estate of Gatchina, miles away from the splendor of St. Petersburg. It was a soft exile. There, Paul built his own miniature world, a terrifying mirror of his father's obsession. He drilled his private Gatchina guards with a cruelty that made even the hardest veterans flinch. While Catherine's court was a place of silk, philosophy, and art, Paul's court was a place of iron, boots, and the whip. "My mother plays at being a goddess," Paul would scream at his soldiers, "but I am the only one who knows she is a thief." The dynasty's weight was becoming a physical pressure. Catherine saw that if Paul took the throne, he would dismantle everything she had built. He would burn her books, alienate her allies, and plunge Russia back into the dark ages of his father's whim. The fight for the future. Alexander. In her desperation, Catherine turned her eyes toward the next generation, her grandson, Alexander. She took the boy away from Paul, raising him herself in the light of the Enlightenment. She wanted to skip a generation. She wanted to bypass her broken son and leave the empire to a perfect grandson. This was the ultimate betrayal. Paul watched from Gatchina as his mother groomed his own son to steal his birthright. The palace became a battlefield of whispers. "I am a mother who must choose between her child and her country, and I have always chosen Russia." She began drafting a secret manifesto, a document that would formally disinherit Paul and name Alexander as her successor. But the weight of the crown was making her hands shake. She procrastinated. She waited for the perfect moment that history rarely provides. The deteriorating body. As the psychological war with Paul intensified, Catherine's legendary health began to fail. The mother of modern Russia was now an old woman.
Her legs were swollen with dropsy, her breath was shallow, and the vibrant fire in her eyes was being clouded by the fog of age. She moved with difficulty, yet she refused to let the court see her weakness. She continued to paint her face and wear her heavy robes, but the weight of the dynasty was literally crushing her. "I have outlived my friends," she wrote in a final shaky letter to Grimm. "I have outlived my lovers, and now I am fighting a war against my own blood." The final sunset of the autocrat. The tension reached a breaking point in the autumn of 1796. The secret manifesto sat in her desk, unsigned. Paul was at Gatchina, waiting like a vulture. Alexander was in the palace, torn between the grandmother he adored and the father he feared. Catherine spent her final nights staring at the portraits of the Romanovs. She saw the blood, the coups, and the madness that had defined the dynasty. She had tried to make it great, but she realized that she could not control the future from the grave. "The weight is too much," she whispered as she collapsed in her dressing room. The struggle for the future of the Romanovs was not decided by a law or a manifesto. It was decided by a stroke. As Catherine lay dying, unable to speak, Paul rushed to the palace. His first act was not to weep for her mother, but to find the secret desk. He found the manifesto. He found the evidence of her betrayal. And as the great empress breathed her last, the shadow of the father finally stepped into the light. The legacy of the conflict. The war between Catherine and Paul was the final tragedy of the hidden reign. She had saved Russia, but she had lost her family. She had built a modern empire, but she had left it in the hands of a man who hated her. "They never taught you this," the narrator concludes, that the greatest conqueror in Russian history was defeated by her own nursery. The final sunset. The sun does not set on an empire, it sets on the person who held it together. On the morning of November 6, 1796, the Winter Palace was shrouded in a heavy slate-gray fog, a mist that seemed to rise from the Neva to reclaim the woman who had transformed its banks. Catherine the Great, the Prussian pawn who had arrived in Russia with nothing but a trunk of modest clothes and an iron will, was dying. She lay in her private chambers, her breathing a ragged echo of a life lived at the speed of light. As the final curtain began to fall, the hidden reign was about to pass into the realm of legend. The quiet collapse of a titan. There was no grand battlefield death, there was only the quiet, sudden betrayal of the body. Catherine had collapsed in her dressing room, the place where she had spent decades painting the mask of the autocrat. As she lay unconscious, the palace around her descended into a frantic, hushed chaos. Her son, Paul, moved through the corridors like a shadow, already searching for the papers that would dismantle her legacy. Her grandson, Alexander, wept by her bedside, but Catherine was already elsewhere. In her final hours, the whispers of the court faded, replaced by the silence of history. "I came to Russia a poor girl, and I shall leave her with a crown of diamonds and a heart of steel." The legacy of the nothing into everything. The final sunset invites us to look back at the sheer impossibility of her journey. Catherine had no Russian blood. She had no legal right to the throne. She was a woman in a man's world, a foreigner in a xenophobic land, a philosopher in a land of the whip. Yet she left behind a superpower. She had expanded the borders by thousands of miles, the Great Expansion. She had brought the medicine of the future to a land of the past, the mother of modern Russia. She had turned a cultural backwater into the envy of the world, the patron of the arts. She had survived the loveless bed, the Pugachev storm, and the French shadow. She didn't just rule Russia, she invented the modern idea of it. The weight of the paradox. But a final sunset also casts long shadows. As history judges her, it cannot ignore the serfdom paradox. She had spoken of liberty, but strengthened slavery. She had praised the Enlightenment, but died a reactionary. This was her tragedy. She was a woman of the 19th century, trapped in the 18th. She had the vision to see a free Russia, but the wisdom to know that a free Russia would have devoured her. "I have done what was possible," she once told Potemkin. "Only God and the fools expect the impossible." The empty throne and the changing guard. When the heart finally stopped, when the Minerva of the North took her last breath, a profound silence fell over St. Petersburg. For 34 years, she had been the sun around which everything orbited. Now the gravity was gone. Paul I ascended the throne and immediately began a campaign of spite. He dug up his father's bones, Peter III, and forced Catherine's pallbearers to honor the man she had overthrown. He burned her manifestos. He changed the laws of succession to ensure no woman would ever rule Russia again. But Paul could not erase the stone. He could not erase the Hermitage, the Black Sea Fleet, or the schools. He could not erase the fact that Catherine had made Russia too large for any small man to ruin. The immortality of the great. Catherine's true sunset was not her death, it was her transition into the Russian soul. Every time a Russian poet wrote in the language she helped refine, every time a scientist used the foundations she built, and every time the world looked at Russia as a great power, Catherine was there. She arrived with nothing, she left with everything. She was the Prussian pawn who became the mother of the country. She was a woman of passion, power, and scandals, but above all, she was a woman of intellect. "Let them talk of my lovers," the ghost of Catherine might say, looking down at the magnificent city that bears her mark of her hand. "Let them whisper of the Orloffs and the Potemkins, but look at the map, look at the art, look at the people. I am the one who woke the giant." The final word. As the bells of the Peter and Paul fortress tolled for her funeral, the era of the Enlightenment in Russia came to an end. The 19th century was weighing, with its revolutions and its soul-searching, but it was Catherine who had built the stage upon which that century would play out. The hidden reign was finally over. The sun had set. But in the twilight, the stars she had planted, the stars of art, science, and empire, began to shine with a light that would never truly go out. "Goodbye, Sophie," the wind seemed to whisper through the empty halls of Zerbst. "Long live the great," the stones of St. Petersburg replied.
The winter of the soul. The halls of the Winter Palace had never felt so vast, nor had they ever felt so empty. For 30 years, Catherine the Great had filled these corridors with the electricity of the Enlightenment. She had filled them with the laughter of lovers, the debates of philosophers, and the frantic energy of an empire in the making. But by the early 1790s, a new season had arrived, one that no amount of gilded heating could keep at bay. This was the winter of the soul. It was the period where the Empress of the North realized that while she had conquered the map, time was slowly and ruthlessly conquering her. The death of the giants. The first chill of this inner winter came from the silence of her mailbox. For decades, Catherine's lifeblood had been her correspondence with the giants of France. Voltaire, her master, her North Star, had been her greatest cheerleader. Diderot had been her intellectual sparring partner. But one by one, the lights of the Enlightenment were going out. Voltaire was gone. Diderot was silent. D'Alembert had vanished into the grave. "I am a survivor in a land of ghosts," Catherine wrote in a private letter, her quill scratching against the parchment with a brittle sound. "The giants have fallen, and I am left to rule over the dwarves." Without these men, Catherine felt intellectually orphaned.
The young courtiers surrounding her could flatter her skin and praise her decrees, but they could not challenge her mind. They did not understand the social contract or the spirit of the laws in the way her old friends did. She was the most powerful woman on earth, yet she was starving for a conversation that didn't start with a bow. The mirror of time. The physical toll of her reign began to manifest as a betrayal of the flesh. The woman who had once led 14,000 troops on a white stallion was now a prisoner of her own throne. Her legs, once strong and tireless, were now swollen with dropsy. Every step across the parquet floors was a calculated battle against pain. She began to spend more time in her private rooms, surrounded by her dogs and her clocks. She became obsessed with the ticking of time, a sound that reminded her that even an empress is a tenant, not an owner of her years. "My mirror is a liar," she told her lady-in-waiting, her voice raspy with the fatigue of decades. "It shows me a woman I do not recognize, but the map in my study, that is the only reflection that still makes sense." She found herself retreating into the past. She would spend hours reading her own early notebooks, the ones from the Prussian pawn years. She was looking for the girl from Zerbst, trying to remember what it felt like to have a future that was longer than her past. The loneliness of the autocrat. The most bitter part of the winter of the soul was the realization that power had effectively insulated her from genuine human connection. Potemkin, her partner in power, her twin soul, was dead. With his passing, the last person who could look her in the eye and tell her she was wrong had vanished. Her new favorites, like the young and opportunistic Platon Zuboff, were essentially children. They were 60 years younger than her. They were beautiful, yes, but they were hollow. They looked at her with the eyes of a creditor, not a companion. "They love the crown, but they are terrified of the head that wears it," she whispered to the shadows of her bedroom. She was surrounded by thousands of servants, guards, and courtiers, yet she would often sit at her small dining table and realize that there wasn't a single soul in the palace who truly knew her. She was a monument, not a person. The religious turn. In her winter, Catherine also found herself engaging in a strange, silent dialogue with the Orthodox Church she had once viewed with intellectual skepticism. She wasn't becoming a fanatic, but she was looking for an anchor. She spent more time staring at the icons in the palace chapel. She wasn't praying for her soul as much as she was praying for the soul of Russia. She feared that once she was gone, the chaos of her son, Paul, as seen in chapter 19, would tear down the civilization she had built. "I have built a palace of glass," she mused, "and I am surrounded by people who are eager to throw stones." The final clarity. The winter of the soul was not just a period of sadness, it was a period of final, brutal clarity. Catherine realized that her legacy would not be defined by how she felt, but by what she left behind. She pushed herself to work harder. Even though the pain, she rose early. She continued to write, to decree, and to plan. If her soul was in winter, her mind would remain a fortress. She decided that if she was to be lonely, she would be lonely with dignity. Let the dwarves whisper, "The giant is tired, but the giant is not yet dead." As the chapter closes, we see Catherine sitting by a window, watching the first snow of 1795 fall over the Neva. The hidden rain had reached its final reflective pause. She had lived 1,000 lives in one, and now, as the giants called to her from the other side, she was finally ready to listen. The Polish Insurrection. By 1794, Catherine the Great had spent decades treating Poland like a personal chessboard. She had placed her former lover on its throne. She had carved away its edges in previous partitions, and she had assumed the Polish spirit was broken. She was wrong. In the twilight of her reign, a final fire erupted in the West. It was the Polish insurrection, a desperate, bloody defiance led by a man who had fought for liberty in the American Revolution and now brought that fire home. Tadeusz Kościuszko. This was no longer a game of ink and treaties. This was a war of extinction. The hero of two worlds. Tadeusz Kościuszko was everything Catherine now feared. He was a veteran of the American War of Independence, a friend of Thomas Jefferson, and a believer in the radical idea that a nation belonged to its people, not its masters. "The Pole is a dangerous animal," Catherine remarked to her war council, her eyes narrowing as she read the reports. "He fights with the madness of a man who has nothing left to lose. We must not just defeat him, we must erase the ground he stands on." The scythes against the cannons. The insurrection was a populist explosion. Kościuszko did something that terrified the Russian nobility. He called upon the Polish peasants to fight, promising them freedom in exchange for their service. Thousands of peasants, armed with nothing but scythes turned vertically, the scythe-men, charged against Russian bayonets and cannons. At the Battle of Rakławice, they achieved the impossible, breaking the Russian lines through sheer suicidal bravery. When the news reached St. Petersburg, Catherine did not panic. She grew cold. She realized that a successful revolution in Poland would be a death sentence for the Russian Empire. If the Polish serfs could win their freedom, the Russian serfs would surely be next. "Blood is the only ink that will dry on this map," she decreed. She summoned her most brutal and effective commander, General Alexander Suvorov. The slaughter of Praga. Suvorov moved like a scythe through Poland. He did not seek to occupy, he sought to terrorize. The climax of the insurrection came at the gates of Warsaw, in the suburb of Praga. The battle was a massacre. Suvorov's troops, fueled by years of resentment and the order to end the rebellion at any cost, stormed the barricades. They did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. By the time the sun set, the streets of Praga were choked with the bodies of 20,000 Poles. The Neva may have been calm, but the Vistula ran red. When Catherine received the report of the slaughter, she did not flinch. She promoted Suvorov to field marshal. To her, the blood of Praga was the price of imperial stability. Erasing a nation. With Kościuszko captured and wounded, and Warsaw in ruins, Catherine decided that the Polish question required a final, permanent solution. She would not leave a stump of a nation to rot. She would erase it from the face of the earth. In 1795, the third partition of Poland was signed. Catherine, along with Prussia and Austria, literally tore the map into pieces. Russia took the lion's share, Lithuania, Kurland, and the remaining parts of Ukraine and Belarus. "Poland is no more," Catherine wrote with a steady hand. "It is not a defeat, it is a disappearance." She ordered the Polish crown royal to be brought to St. Petersburg, where it was broken down. She even ordered the name Poland to be forbidden.
The gilded prison of Paul I. Power is a heavy crown, but for Paul I, it was a crown made of thorns, placed upon his head by his own mother. While Catherine the Great was busy expanding the Russian map, she was simultaneously engaged in a cold, calculated, and devastating psychological war at home. This was the story of the gilded prison, a mother's attempt to break her son's spirit to ensure that her enlightened legacy survived his perceived madness. The architecture of isolation. Catherine did not lock Paul in a dungeon, she locked him in a palace. By granting him the massive estate of Gatchina, she provided him with a kingdom of sand. It was a gilded cage, miles away from the true center of power in St. Petersburg. "I have given him a playground," Catherine once remarked with a chilling smile, "so that he does not mistake the playground for the throne." She systematically stripped him of his duties. She denied him a seat on her council. She refused to let him lead her armies in real battle, and she kept him in a state of perpetual adolescence. Paul was a man in his 30s, yet he had less power than his mother's youngest lovers. This was not just a political exclusion, it was a psychological dismantling. Catherine wanted him to feel small so that he would never dare to be great. The mirror of fear. The most potent weapon in Catherine's arsenal was the ghost of Peter III. Every time she looked at Paul, she saw the man she had overthrown and murdered. She didn't just see a son, she saw a threat. She encouraged the court to whisper about Paul's instability. She allowed rumors to circulate that he was mentally unfit to rule, the same tactic she had used against her husband. Paul, aware of this, became increasingly paranoid. He lived in a state of constant fear that a stomachache or an accidental fall would end his life, just as it had ended his father's. "The air in Gatchina is thick with the scent of 1762, Paul wrote in his secret diary. "My mother does not love me. She is merely waiting for the right moment to erase me." The theft of the next generation. The cruelest blow in this psychological warfare was Catherine's treatment of Paul's own children. When Paul's first son, Alexander, was born, Catherine didn't just take the child into her palace, she took him into her soul. She effectively kidnapped her grandchildren, raising them as her own, and forbidding Paul and his wife from having any say in their education or upbringing. "You are the biological father," Catherine told Paul, in a voice as cold as a Siberian winter, "but I am the imperial mother. I am raising an emperor, not a soldier of Gatchina." By grooming Alexander to be her successor, she was telling Paul that he was a lost generation. She was making him irrelevant while he was still alive. This created a profound, jagged wound in Paul's psyche, turning his grief into a simmering, explosive rage. The Prussian obsession. In response to her mother's silk and philosophy, Paul retreated into iron and boots. In his gilded prison, he created a world that was the exact opposite of Catherine's enlightenment. He obsessed over Prussian military drills, rigid uniforms, and brutal discipline. Catherine watched this from a distance with a mixture of pity and contempt. To her, Paul's obsession with toy soldiers was proof that he was unfit for the throne. But to Paul, those soldiers were the only things he could control. "Let her have her books and her lovers," Paul screamed at his troops during a midnight drill. "I have the bayonet, and the bayonet does not lie." The final silence. As Catherine's health failed, the psychological warfare reached its peak. She spent her final months attempting to legally disinherit him. She treated him like a stranger at her own table, often looking through him as if he were already a ghost. The gilded prison had done its work. It had turned a sensitive, intelligent boy into a bitter, frightened, and erratic man. Catherine had saved her legacy from him during her lifetime, but in doing so, she had ensured that his reign, whenever it came, would be a violent reaction against everything she stood for. "I have built a wall between him and the throne," Mother Catherine mused in her final days. "But walls have a habit of falling, and when this one falls, it will crush the very things I love." The chapter ends with Paul standing on the ramparts of Gatchina, staring towards St. Petersburg with eyes filled with a terrifying, vengeful light. The prison was about to open, and the Empress was about to discover that a broken son is the most dangerous enemy an empire can have. The shadow of the guillotine. In the autumn of 1793, the winds blowing from Paris did not carry the scent of perfume or the melodies of the opera. They carried the stench of wet iron and old blood. In the Winter Palace, Catherine the Great sat at her mahogany desk, the candlelight flickering against the walls like the ghosts of her executed friends. This was the era of the shadow of the guillotine. For decades, Catherine had been the crowned philosopher, the woman who had welcomed the Enlightenment with open arms. But now she looked into the mirror of the French Revolution and saw a monster that bore her own intellectual features. The terror in the ink. Catherine's private letters from this period, written primarily to her confidant Melchior Grimm, reveal a woman in the throes of a profound ideological crisis. The liberal empress was being consumed by the reactionary sovereign. "The French madness is a plague," she wrote, her pen digging so hard into the paper it nearly tore the fiber. The execution of Marie Antoinette hit Catherine with a force that shifted her very soul. She saw in the fallen queen not just a woman, but the fragility of the entire social order. If a queen's head could roll into a wicker basket in the Place des Révolutions, then no crown in the world, not even the Romanov crown, was safe. The Enlightenment betrayed. The psychological toll was immense. She felt a sense of personal betrayal by the philosophers she had once supported. She blamed Voltaire and Rousseau for providing the vocabulary of the mob. To her, the social contract had become a suicide pact. "I was a fool," she confessed, in a letter that remained hidden for years. "I thought light could be controlled. I thought reason would build bridges. Instead, it has built a guillotine. These Republicans are not men of thought. They are the disciples of chaos." She began to systematically purge her own library. The books that had once been her nighttime companions were now viewed as venomous snakes. She ordered a portrait of Voltaire to be moved to a dark, unused storage room. The Enlightenment was no longer her pride, it was her shame. The Fortress of St. Petersburg. The shadow forced Catherine to turn Russia into a fortress. She became obsessed with the infection of French ideas. Her private letters reveal a growing paranoia that the French shadow was lengthening across the Russian steppes. "Every Frenchman in my empire is now a spy until proven otherwise," she commanded. She demanded that every French citizen living in Russia swear a public holy oath of hatred against the revolution. Those who refused were stripped of their property and banished to the border. She stopped the printing of new books. She banned private travel to Europe. She even prohibited the wearing of certain revolutionary fashions, like tricolor ribbons. She was attempting to stop a hurricane with a silk curtain.
"I am the wall," she wrote to Grimm. "If I crack, the abyss swallows the east. I must be hard. I must be cold. I must be the absolute master of every thought in this empire." The final reactionary. By the peak of the terror, Catherine had become a ghost of her former self. The woman who had once proposed a new law based on justice now believed only in the new law of the whip. She looked at the peasants in the fields and saw not souls, but potential Jacobins. She looked at the writers in the cafes and saw not thinkers, but assassins. The shadow of the guillotine had effectively murdered the girl from Zerbst. What remained was a shivering, angry titan clinging to her scepter with a grip of iron. "The age of dreams is over," she concluded in her final letter to Grimm. "The age of the sword has returned. May God forgive the philosophers, for I never shall." The chapter ends with Catherine staring into the fireplace, watching a French pamphlet curl and blacken in the flames.
The shadow was no longer just in Paris. It was inside her own mind, a darkness that would stay with her until her very last breath.